I just remember saying to God, I look back at my Christian life and it seems like it is mess after mess after mess. I wish this wasn't my story. And I just felt the beautiful whisper saying, when I look at your life, I see mercy after mercy after mercy. Often we want the quick fix. We want the testimony, which is, I was a drug addict, now I'm clean. I was sick and now I'm healed. We love the dramatic story. But most often, and even for people who have those dramatic testimonies, there is then that sanctification process. We need to walk a longer journey with people to really see them come out of poverty, which is a hard slog, but we're hungry for more.
Welcome everybody, this is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Inspired, if you're new to us, is all about meeting different mates of mine who are doing beautiful stuff across the world, all sorts of different journeys. Everyone's story is different, your story is different as you listen. And I can do what you can't do and you can do what I can't do, but we get so relentlessly bombarded by negativity in the press. And what we do is once a week we get together, this fast expanding community. It's just to meet great people who've got their challenges, have had their sucker punches, but who are still in there and living out their story. And it's just so encouraging. I've got no doubt this week you're going to be encouraged because we've got with us the fantastic Natalie Williams. Hello, Natalie.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really looking forward to this. So Natalie, for a bit of context, grew up in a working class family in Hastings. I was preaching there just a few months ago, one of the most deprived towns in the UK. She's worked as a journalist. She's written a number of books. Here I've got the book Invisible Divides and 'Tis Mercy All that I've been devouring over the last few days. Natalie's the chief executive of the charity Jubilee Plus, which we're going to hear plenty about, and they basically equip churches to change the lives of those in poverty in their communities. And we only go back a few weeks, but it was really funny how we first met. So let's both tell the story. Natalie, why don't you start?
Yeah, so I was in the queue at the Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast, this kind of national annual event that I go to a lot. And as the queue was winding round, I saw you and I thought, I think that podcast guy, sorry, that's the way I refer to you, but I think that's that guy. I've been listening to this podcast because 2 weeks earlier, a friend of mine, Chris, had said to me, you must listen to this podcast. And I'll be honest with you, I don't really listen to podcasts. So anyway, I had started with one and then just devoured about 10 episodes in under 2 weeks. And so I saw you in the queue and I thought, I want to tell him how great his podcast is. But I just thought, don't be that person. It was like 6:45 in the morning outside at Westminster. It's just starting to rain. I was thinking, don't be a fangirl. You'll embarrass yourself. So I didn't. I decided not to talk to you. But then about 20 minutes later, we literally crossed paths inside the Great Hall at Westminster. And I just in that split second thought, I will encourage him. So I said, hi, you Simon, as you know. I was then like, I'm late to the party, but I've just got into your podcast. Thank you so much. And that's when you asked my name. And when I said my name, It was kind of a weird experience, wasn't it?
It was so funny because Natalie Williams. And what was hilarious was that in that previous week, one of your good mates, Laura Goodsmith, had been in touch. She'd written to me and said, you've got to get Natalie Williams on the podcast. Another person had written the same. And so I had literally the night before gone to sleep listening to your dulcet tones as you gave a talk wherever it was. And so it was just so funny. And I'd clocked you in the queue as we snaked it's like at the airport when you snake to and fro. So brilliant to have met. Hopefully, it was a God incidence, wasn't it? Because that's why we're doing this now, and actually with a bit of context rather than complete cold contact. So listen, let's just get into it. I know, you had a challenging time growing up. What was it like?
Yeah, so as you said, I grew up in a working class family, but also for a lot of my childhood in poverty as well, in Hastings, or I call it Hastings. Lived on the 16th floor of a block of council flats, didn't have any central heating. Often when I tell that to crowds of teenagers, they just look at me like, you're so old, central heating probably wasn't around when you were young, but that's not true. We just couldn't afford central heating. I had free school meals. My early childhood was affected by the death of a sibling. So when I was 3 years old, my brother died. And to be honest, I'm not sure what my family life would have been like. It might have been pretty horrendous anyway, because my dad has quite a violent past. But it's like that moment when my brother died just completely sort of tore our family apart, but from the inside out. And then over many years, the full destruction of it kind of just took its hold. So From my earliest childhood memories, you know, my dad would regularly tell me he hated me. He was violent. There was my family life. I sort of sometimes say it was affected in my early childhood years by death, disability, debt, divorce, like all these D words that you really don't want your childhood to be affected by. But the funny thing about it is that, if I'm honest, I didn't realise it was any different to anyone else's life, because it wasn't uncommon with the other kids at school that their lives were sort of the same sort of stories and things. So I didn't feel like, oh, I'm in poverty. If someone had said, you know, like, you're poor, you're the poor, I would have probably punched them in the face, because I would have been like, what do you mean? I'm not. And so I wouldn't have really particularly identified as in poverty or working class, or even from a troubled background or a rough background. The moment at which I started to realise all those things were true was actually when I was a teenager, and I started going to church. And the reason I started going to church is because I liked a boy. So I wasn't looking for Jesus. In fact, I remember from at least the age of sort of 10 or 11 being a zealous atheist. Like I was very angry at this God that I didn't believe existed. So that's kind of funny, isn't it? When I was like adamant I don't believe in God, but had so much like seething anger actually. And I was angry at God that my brother had died. You know, if there's a God, what sort of God lets little babies die? But I was also angry at God about my life. Just, you know, like I felt so rejected and hated from such a young age, and just felt like if there's a God, he's awful. And so was kind of both hating God and not believing in God. And I knew a couple of Christians at school, and I was that person who tried to persuade them to become atheists. I was like an evangelist for atheism. I don't think I made either of them lose their faith, thankfully. But then, at the age of 15, I found out that this boy I liked, and to be honest, it was a boy I liked for about a week, you know, in that way you do when you're a teenager, but that went to church. And me and my mate decided we would go to church to see this boy. And I never ended up with a boy. And I did end up with Jesus, and that has been the better thing. And I recently realised, I'd actually say that about every loss in my life, that where I've ended up with not the thing I wanted, but with Jesus, it's always been the better thing. That's kind of one of the stories of my life, I guess, that it feels like there's been a lot of loss over the years, but I've had Jesus now since I was 15. And so I became a Christian, I feel like, kicking and screaming. I didn't really know what I was doing, if I'm honest with you. There was a moment where I was in this church. The boy I liked had got up and given his testimony about what Jesus meant to him, and he had been crying. And I just thought, what a loser this guy is. Like, what is wrong with him? Like, why is someone standing up talking about Jesus and crying? And so I went off him immediately. And yet for some humanly inexplicable reason, I kept going to church for another 3 or 4 months. And I wasn't on a journey in that time. I genuinely, every Sunday was there thinking, this is boring. I'm not going to become a Christian. I'm still an atheist. And then the funny thing is, a boy started coming because he liked me. It's this little chain of teenagers who fancied each other. And one Sunday there was a call to go forward if you wanted to maybe recommit your life to Jesus, because everyone went forward, like the whole church. And this is a church of about 300 people, and all of them went to the front. Wow. And me and this boy who liked me stood there going, what is going on? And we started to see these people fall onto the floor. And we were just like, this is weird. Like, what's this about? And again, no interest in it, no desire to get involved in it in any way. If anything, much the opposite. But then someone came up to us and said, we need to move chairs out of the way, so can you move? And so we ended up sort of getting pushed forward to the back of this big crowd. And then these 2 guys came up and said, could we pray for you? And we didn't really know them. So I think just to not be rude, we said yes. So while they're praying for us, a teacher of ours who knows that we're not Christians, what he thinks we've responded to the gospel, and comes over very excitedly to pray for us. And what I thought happened is that he put his hand forcefully on my head and pushed me to the floor. I was freaked out by that, as you would be, and, you know, basically got up off the floor. But the boy who'd come with me then became a Christian, because he said no one was touching you. And if that could happen to you, then there must be a God. So he became a Christian. But the funny thing was, I didn't. So I was like, it's not. Who is this God who throws people to the floor and makes them feel a hand on their head? And I was just like, there's no way I'm just, becoming a Christian at this point.
So just for clarity, it wasn't the teacher pushing you over.
No.
It was God.
No one touched me. No one had their hand. And because this boy, and obviously I believed him because he had no reason to lie to me. He was only there because he liked me. He wasn't interested in God either. But like I say, he became a Christian on the spot, because when I said to him, like, that our teacher just pushed me over, he said, no, Nat, no one was touching you. There was no one. He was near you, but no one had a hand on you. And I was like, no, I felt a hand on my head push me over. And he said, no, there was no one touching you. And then he was like, so I'm becoming a Christian right now.
Wow.
And I was just way more stubborn than that, though. And a bit like, well, who is this God? And just because there now probably is a God, because something weird has just happened to me, I'm not just going to become a Christian because now I'm being told that that's what, I think there's just something of a fighter within me, which sometimes can be really good and other times can just be really stubborn and rebellious. And so on this occasion, I was like, I'm not becoming a Christian. So I went away for probably about just under 3 months and read the Gospels and wanted to see who this Jesus was. And during that time was definitely on a journey of, I believe there's a God. Now I think it is Jesus who's God. Just lots of questions, lots of confusion. And obviously the big question then for me of, well, what sort of God, like, lets babies die? And what sort of God lets, a child grow up in this horrible environment were more of a problem to me than they'd been before. So although I did become a Christian, about 3 months after that experience of God, I would say that at least the first 10 years of my Christian life was very volatile, very up and down. But genuinely, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of wrestling with God, a lot of arguing with God. I think I didn't really... I think I would flip between this, I'm grateful for salvation, but also I'm still pretty angry at God. And so just trying to navigate that as a Christian. But then at the same time, I was saved into a very middle-class church. And as someone from a background of poverty and from a working class background, and those two things aren't the same thing, but they obviously did overlap in my life, I felt very at odds with everyone around me, even just so much of ordinary life. I had this massive culture shock. There was the culture shock of church and worship, and I got saved into a church where people lift their hands in the air. I was like, what's that about? And pray in tongues, and there was so much stuff I didn't understand that was kind of, like religious stuff. But then I didn't understand how these people behaved, in that they all seemed to have disposable money. They all seemed to own property. They ate their meals in a weird way to me. I'd never seen food served where you get meat in one dish, vegetables in another, potatoes in another, and you say to someone, you help yourself, like, because you're the guest. And so well-meaning, lovely Christians who were inviting me round for dinner, I just didn't know what I was supposed to do. And it actually caused me a load of anxiety, if I'm honest. Like, they were trying to welcome me, but I was feeling dread. I remember once sitting trying to calculate how many people were at the table and how many potatoes were in the dish to try and work out how many am I supposed to take, because they want me to go first because I'm the guest. Yeah, I don't know, it was just funny. And then communication was a big one, where just my mum taught me that if someone asks you a question, you give them an honest answer. And so that did not go well for me in church for years, actually, because I would get asked things like, how did you find this morning's service? And I would say, actually, I was a bit bored. Didn't know you're not supposed to say that in church. Yeah. So being in church was actually really, really hard. And there's some ways, even now, 30 years on, I still feel like there are some ways in which I don't fit in. Some of my values are still different to the majority around me. But I think what I didn't know then is that Jesus deliberately saves people from all walks of life. I didn't realise that. I thought, if I can't assimilate and become like these people, then Jesus actually mustn't want me, because these are the people he wants. And so that was a real wrestle for me for probably at least half my Christian life so far. That idea of does God really want someone like me? Because I don't see many like me around, and I definitely don't see them in leadership positions or in kind of anything that seems like you would have any influence in church life. Or so that's been a real struggle of my Christian life, actually.
And I know it was bumpy. It's quite funny listening to you talk about your youth worker. So years later, describing what you were like.
Yeah. So I asked him a few years ago, because I was doing a talk to youth and I wanted to encourage them that God can take any life and do anything with it. And so I asked my youth leader from when I was 15, could you just let me know what I was like? And I said, you don't have to sugarcoat it, because I want to use it in a talk. So tell me honestly. And so he wrote back, yeah, you were a right screwed up mess. And I was like, wow, he really didn't sugarcoat it, did he? But he also, we just talked about that. And he was like, you were clearly in a lot of pain, actually. But often people who are troubled can be a lot of trouble as well. And I was definitely both. I would describe myself as both troubled and causing quite a lot of trouble. And we had about 60 or 70 teenagers in our youth group when I was that age. And I know now that, and I probably knew it at the time, if they'd had to line us all up by who will still be following Jesus 30 years later, I would have been very low down the end. But also if they'd say, well, who do you think will one day be speaking in churches, around the country and sometimes in other countries too, and writing books on poverty and stuff like this, they would not have thought God. I think even though they believe God can do astonishing things, I think they would have thought it won't be you. And I love that God does that. Now I really am grateful that God calls the weak and the foolish, and he goes after those that others would despise and reject, or not even necessarily that, but just would think, I don't think you've got much to contribute. And Jesus goes, I'm going to astonish people by what I can do in a life like that. And I just love that. And of course, it's not about whether you speak in churches or write books. Actually, the truth is, I am able to hold down a job, which I would not have been able to do if I hadn't encountered Jesus. I'm able to be faithful and reliable with things. Even though I still have little bits of chaos around me in my life reflecting my background, I'm able to be a faithful friend. I'm able to be a faithful member of church. I'm able to just do things that for me would not have been possible apart from the saving work of Jesus in my life. And I just love that he transforms like that.
Yeah. And, shout out to all those teachers, all those Sunday school teachers, all those youth workers. When you see those difficult kids, it's funny because I went on camp. And I don't know if you know Vaughan Roberts, but Different Streams. But he's a very well-known speaker and written a number of books. Brilliant guy at St. Ebbe's, Oxford. And he was my dorm group leader. And we just had, in those days, the leader would sleep in the dorm with you. And he was probably 23 and I was this obnoxious 15-year-old. And we would not go to sleep. And at 2:00 in the morning on the second night, he turns the light on. He says, guys, we need to go. And we just jumped on him and smashed his face. Pillows, zero respect. And then all these years later, we preached together at Keswick. And I was reminding him of, just the absolute Burke, I don't know what word I can get with on a podcast, but just a complete pain in the rear end that I had been. And that's the grace of God. And actually, those guys that don't conform will actually probably, are wired that way to have the oomph to be world changers, which is what you are. So God's grace and how he's wired you. And I love what he's done in your life. So take it forward. Teenage years into 20s wasn't straightforward, but you're the first of your family ever to go to university.
Yeah. Well, so before I went to university, I decided I wanted to do a gap year and give my that year to God. And what was incredible was, so my church, although they, I think, found me difficult, they had seen God do quite a lot of work. And it's all about what you've seen, isn't it? So if you know someone used to be impossible and now they're a bit tricky, you've seen progress. So they sent me off to this other church in Andover in Hampshire, this tiny little place. I couldn't believe it when I got there. There was no McDonald's, which I thought was awful. I was astonished that this could be the case. And when I got to this church, they had only had one gap year student before, like the year earlier. And she was so amazing, they'd kept her on for a second year. Like, she came from this lovely, secure Christian family. She was lovely. She had the most servant heart. And so when they said to her, like, oh, can you do this or can you do that? She was like, yes, yes. Like, how can I serve? And then, of course, I turn up. And I am not like that at all. And every time they ask me to do anything, my first question is always, why? And I realise now, looking back, how annoying that must have been, and how I would have just come across as like totally obnoxious and rebellious. But actually the why was a genuine question. I'm still a bit like that now. I like to know why I'm being asked to do something, or why that's seen as important or whatever. And so I asked all these why questions. I made myself a right pain in the backside in a number of ways. And I think this church was a much smaller church. I really struggled with that. There weren't many teenagers or early 20s, so I struggled with that. And then the one who I was sharing a flat with was this other girl, a year older than me, who's just the beautifully servant-hearted Christian. So I felt like so bad compared to her, not because of her. She was lovely to me, but that just made me feel even worse. And so I think they just questioned, are you even a Christian? And so 3.5 months into this gap year, I got kicked off it. And honestly, I just felt so rejected by God. I felt so rejected by the church. I felt, it is kind of funny now when I tell it, I talk about how I said to God, God, Lord, can I give you a year of my life? And the Lord went, no, you're all right. 3.5 months will do, thanks. But at the time, it was incredibly painful. I mean, I was devastated. They were shocked I hadn't seen it coming. They really were like, really taken aback that I was surprised and how upset I was. And I was just like, wow, this God really doesn't want me. So my question for my first 3.5 years as a Christian was, does this God really want people like me? And it felt like they definitively answered that question. No, he doesn't. So I ended up back in Hastings. I felt like this massive failure. Of course, I thought that the whole church thought I was a failure. Most people in the church had no idea who I was, but, you're the centre of your own little world, aren't you? So I just was so embarrassed and ashamed and didn't know what to do with myself. And also when I phoned my mum and told her, she was like, you can't come home. There's no bed for you anymore. And so I had to, I sofa surfed for a few weeks with people in the church, and then a couple in the church took me in, and it just felt pretty awful, really. And then the same youth leader I was just talking about, him and his wife basically tried to disciple me, but I ended up telling them to F off, basically, and just being done with it. And when I then ran off to visit some friends who were at Reading University, and I only spent a long weekend with them, but while I was away, I thought, I'm not going to give my life to God now. I'm going to go to university instead. And I'd got good enough grades that I could get in through clearing. I went off to uni, first person in my family. And really interestingly at that point, then started to feel like I didn't fit in anywhere, because not only did I not fit in with these churchy people, and then not fit in at uni at all. So at uni, I was scrabbling around for money all the time. I was so poor. I often wouldn't eat properly for a week. Like, when I say not eat properly, I remember one week where I think I ate one hot cross bun and a packet of wine gums in the whole week. I got a job at Domino's Pizza, which was great because then you could eat while you were at work, free pizza. So then started living off pizza. But then I also felt like I didn't fit in with my family, because I'd gone to university, which was such a weird thing for me to have done, and not something that my family, they weren't unsupportive, but they just were a bit baffled, I think. Like, why are you doing this? You're going to get into loads of debt. And they were right about that. And so at uni, I was running away from God. I was, again, so angry with God. I was like, why did you bother giving me an experience of you and having all these people tell me that you want me and you love me just to reject me? So basically, God, you can get stuff too. And so threw myself into soft drugs. Thankfully, I never got into hard drugs. Actually, every time I had an opportunity, something stopped it happening, which I now think was the grace and the kindness of God to me, because I got an addictive personality. So the minute I'd have gone down that route, I'd have probably been off. I picked up a very heavy smoking habit. I got myself in loads of debt. I decided to travel, which I'd never done. So I went backpacking around Europe on borrowed money that wasn't mine. And just by the time I came out of uni, I had managed to get a degree, which was a miracle in and of itself, but I also was in so much debt that I had a debt collection agency coming after me. But at the same time, I was kind of doing well for myself in that I became a journalist. I ended up working like a little bit for the Daily Mirror, a little bit for GQ magazine. Like I kind of was doing all right for myself, but I was an utter mess. I was self-harming. I was deeply depressed. I was desperate to find satisfaction outside of God because I didn't want to come back to God. But I knew God was chasing me. So I would have that song, Lord, you have my heart and I will search for yours. Jesus, take my life and lead me on. Run through my head all the time, and I'd be so furious about it. I would be like, God, you do not have my heart. Do not take my life. You didn't want me. Leave me alone. And I would wake up in the middle of the night praying in tongues and be like, God, what's your problem? Like, you have rejected me. Why can't you now let me go? Your word says I've got free will and I choose to leave you and not have anything to do with you. Why are you pursuing me? Now, of course, today's version of that story is the wonderful bit from Psalm 23, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And honestly, I look back and I'm like, I walked down some really dark paths. God spared me from a lot of situations where, you know, I probably shouldn't be here now, except for the intervention of God in a whole number of situations. And his pursuit of me, despite my arrogance, rebellion, my misunderstanding, which, to be honest, most of it came from a place of just not knowing I was loved. Just having this rejection mindset, which I had just put onto God in this massive way where I couldn't even really see anything else of God. But he came after me. And I'm just, even now, you know, that's 20 years ago, and I'm amazed that God came after me. I'm amazed that he didn't go, well, fine, you can have what you want then, you know. But he chased after me despite my rejection of him. And so I was so fixated on his rejection of me, we're not realising that here's a God who's pursuing me with costly love and mercy and kindness. And I'm rejecting him and yet complaining that he's rejecting me. So I'm so grateful that he brought me back to him. But do you know what? Even that wasn't easy. When I came back to God, I was living in China, which was a bit odd. I'd gone to Beijing. I tried to settle on the far side of the sea to get away from God. And I came back to God out there. I was working as a journalist and I came back to God. I had this incredible experience where basically I went and sat in this bar and wrote a letter to God and basically said, God, if you don't help me in the next 7 days, I'm going to commit suicide. I was deeply, deeply depressed. Like I said, I was self-harming. I was, you know, addictive, rejected, insecure, crippled by insecurities. And I could see no way out of the misery that I was facing, and also that I felt like I'd created some of it as well. And I sat in this bar and I said to God, if you don't help me, if you don't send someone to help me in the next 7 days, I'm going to commit suicide. And on day 6, I don't know why God always does that. But he didn't do it on day 1, but on day 6, a woman arrived to work in our newspaper group, and she was a Christian, born again, spirit-filled, Bible-believing Christian. And it just gave me hope. And I felt like she kind of nursed me back into the faith. We were only in China together for 4 months. We're still really good friends now. She's one of my best mates. She lives in America again. I'm back in the UK. We had those 4 months together, but her role in my life in those 4 months was so significant. And again, just for anyone who doesn't know whether their role in someone's life is significant, you don't actually need to be in someone's life for a long time to play a massive part in it. She massively helped me come back to God. She helped me believe again, or believe maybe even for the first time that this God really did want me. And then I said to God, okay, now I'll go anywhere in the world except Hastings. please don't send me back there. And I felt God say to me really clearly, I want you to go back to Hastings. And I was like, I can't. I mean, for one thing, I had nowhere to live. I ended up moving back in with my mum and having to sleep on the floor for 18 months because she still didn't have a bed for me. This is a few years on now, but she still didn't have a bed for me. And so I slept on the floor for 18 months. And yeah, I think partly she didn't then want to get a bed either, but towards the end of it, because she thought, if I get a bed, you're going to stay. And she was proven right. I ended up living back with her. Having said, can I come and stay for 3 weeks? I ended up living back with her for 13 years. Wow. And but that's been massive. I don't live with her now, but that was massively restorative for our relationship, which had not been very good. I had been very cruel to her because of my childhood, because of my upbringing. I sort of, although actually my dad was the person who was very mean and violent, I blamed my mum for not protecting me. I blamed her for not leaving him. I was angry with her, and we had some blazing rows when I moved back in, even though I'd come back to God. But yeah, so I said to God, I'll go anywhere but Hastings. And he said, go to Hastings. I said, okay, fine. I'll go to Hastings, but I won't go back to that church that I got saved into. And God said, go back to that church. And several years later, I ended up working for the church, running communications and social action. And that's just a whole, I guess, I love the way God redeems those things. I mean, it's kind of annoying when you tell God you don't want to do something and you know he's going to tell you to do it. But at the same time, then when you are obedient, there's such a beautiful redemption that takes place in the midst of that. And so, yeah. And I'm still in Hastings now, and I'm still in that church. And basically it's
wonderful.
been obeying God in the staying put has been quite an interesting challenge for me.
Hey folks, I'm loving the impact of the podcast and how much joy and encouragement it's bringing. Listen, here's some potential action points if you're enjoying it. The first one is we love feedback. So why don't you tell us where you listen to the podcast and how it's impacted your life by sending us a 1-minute voice note to podcast@greatlakesoutreach.org. We might air a few of those. Another thing you could do is give us a review on Spotify or iTunes. Subscribe there. Also, can you subscribe to our YouTube channel? We're trying to grow our presence there, and actually that is a key way of getting it out there further. Another way is to recruit new signups. So could you think of 3 people that you could say, yeah, hey, this podcast, I'm loving it, and I'd love you to engage with it as well. And then lastly, if you want to give to the work, this podcast comes out under the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach. We're working in Burundi, which is currently the second poorest and the hungriest country in the world. The needs are absolutely massive. And what's amazing, and we never did it for this purpose, but the money that's coming in through people like yourselves who are loving it is funding 5 ministries out in Burundi right now. That's impacting thousands upon thousands of lives. So, if you gave 20 quid a month, 20 quid here is like 200 quid out there, or $50 a month, that's like $500 of impact. I just stick a zero on it in terms of knowing how far money goes out there. So we'd love it. You could do a one-off or a regular monthly support to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. That's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. And let's spread the love. All right. So 4 potential action points. You could do 1 or all 4. So that's feedback, sending in a voice note to us. You could give us a great review on Spotify or iTunes and subscribe to the YouTube channel. You could recruit others and gossip the podcast and get other signups, or you could give to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. I'll put all those links in the show notes below. And now let's get back to the podcast. So what was the journey then to becoming, amazing? It's not patronizing at all to say, from your background, from the difficult cards you were dealt, to being chief executive of a charity doing fantastic work, Jubilee Plus? What was that journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing. I, again, just love what God does. So the journey then is, so I was working as a journalist, and then in Hastings, I couldn't really get a decent job as a journalist. So I crossed into sort of PR and marketing, and then did pretty well at that, actually, in terms of just the bit of work I was doing was around communicating good news stories around crime, which is a weird thing, a weird job to have, but came to the attention of the Home Office, then started getting sent all about. And I think also possibly then at that point, because of having success in my secular job, came to the attention maybe of my church leader a bit more than I might have otherwise. And I was offering, do you want some help with communication? But at that point, I think they wanted a bit more help with some outward focused community groups. We were going from a sort of internal small group structure to being much more outward looking. And the church leader was like, would you come and help? And he really took a chance on me, I think, in putting me in a leadership role, paid leadership role in church, because I wasn't like any of the other leaders in my church. I wonder if he had times where he thought, I don't know what I've done. Because again, I'd be in meetings and we'd talk about doing something and I'd say, why? Like, I'm like a 2-year-old with it. Why, you know? And so I would also, I think he didn't realise I was carrying still a whole load of rejection, a whole load of basically trauma. And so after I'd worked for the church for about a year, I kind of let the mask down and would regularly have times where I would storm out of the building because I was upset at something that had been said to me, and I wouldn't come back for a couple of days, and I would be super argumentative, and I didn't understand the right time to ask a question. And I'd be in meetings all the time where they'd be talking about Sunday services, and I'd be constantly going, well, what about how people in poverty are going to feel about this, or what about how this people with mental health conditions are going to feel about it, and never knew the right way to have those conversations. So it was always just on one about it, you know, like just totally focused on my laser focused area. Sometimes I'd expand that to what about single people, or what about women, or what about people from non-white British backgrounds. Sometimes I would expand my repertoire of things to bang the drum about, but mostly it was around poverty and people from low income backgrounds and working class backgrounds. And at the same time as that, I started to volunteer for this new thing called Jubilee Plus. And Martin Charlesworth, who founded the charity, he wanted to write a weekly blog on the theology of poverty and justice. And he needed someone to edit that blog for him, who was good with grammar and spelling and what have you. And so I heard about that and I offered to volunteer. So I started volunteering for half-hour a week. I think quite quickly, Martin saw leadership potential in me. And I think Martin had quite a lot of experience already of taking risks on unlikely leaders. And so I ended up on his core team, again, a voluntary position, but really felt like these two guys, my church leader, Paul, and Martin, who was leading Jubilee Plus, kind of fathered me. Paul is not that much older than me, but just he'd probably prefer older brother. But yeah, just kind of came alongside me in quite significant fathering roles and saw potential in me, and somehow were able to see through all the chaos, all the argumentativeness, all the one narrow focused mind, the not knowing when to speak and when to hold back. And both of them just seemed to have real faith for me, which, to be honest, if we'd had this conversation probably like 6 or 7 years ago, I'd have told you how annoying, particularly my church leader was, and how we argued all the time, and how, you know, I didn't really realise that the patience that he was giving me in kind of letting me, you know, throw my toys out the pram every now and then and handle myself in a really emotionally immature way. And then I would go and complain to Martin about it. And sometimes they would have to talk about it and try and navigate this. Also, what sort of happened in the middle of this was that the teacher I mentioned, who had thought that I was responding to the gospel and actually had been really foundational in my early faith and a real father figure to me, basically, it turned out he had been committing an awful crime and was arrested and went to prison. And so I felt like the foundations of my faith were being shaken, because this guy through whom I'd seen God as a father now turned out to be much more like my earthly father than I had thought. And so in the midst of that, these other two guys, Paul and Martin, were just consistent, faithful, level-headed, not prone to, you know, kind of I could see when they were frustrated with me, but they were able to handle themselves really, really maturely. And so that just, I think, gave me space with them and with God to work out a whole load of my issues with rejection and abandonment in particular. And so that journey happened in the context of volunteering for Jubilee Plus and working for my church. And someone had a prophetic word for me that they said, I see that God is going to take you on these parallel tracks. One of them is he is going to raise you to prominence, where you're going to be someone who has a platform to speak out on some of these issues around poverty in particular. But I also see this parallel track where he is going to deal with the deep wounds of your past. And I remember at the time in my head thinking, no, please don't do it that way, God. I want you to deal with the past, not give me the prominence, because I know I can't handle it. And please just deal with the past first. And as I was thinking this in my head, the person who prophesied it said, God knows that you don't want him to do it this way, and that you're asking him to do the healing first before you get any opportunities. And God's just saying, no, he won't do it that way. He will do the two things in tandem. And actually, that's totally been what God has done. So Jubilee Plus, I started to be given more and more leadership responsibility. Martin himself was educated in like boarding school and then went to Oxford or Cambridge. And I know that really matters to people who went, but I can never remember which one it is. But he did go to one of them, and hopefully will forgive me for not knowing which one it was. But so I often looked at him and thought, it feels like he was bred for leadership, and I wasn't. Like, he had all these opportunities. He was told he was a leader. It was expected of him, and I'm sure that comes with its own pressures. But for me, no one was expecting anything of me. And so even when I remember in 2020, COVID's obviously happening. I'm now on staff part-time at Jubilee Plus, part-time at my church. I'm running communications for Jubilee Plus, more and more doing the social action, like the mercy ministry stuff in my church. And Martin says, can I meet up with you? I just want to meet with you on my own. And so I'm driving to this meeting thinking, if he wants to meet me on his own, he's leaving. And I think he must be wanting to tell me privately instead of in front of the whole team, because he knows I'm going to be upset at whoever's replacing him. And so I was thinking, I wonder who he's giving the leadership to, who I'm going to be upset about. And you know, he probably just doesn't want me to create a scene in front of everyone, or for my own dignity, he probably doesn't want me to create a scene in front of the whole team when I hear. And so I get to Milton Keynes and, you know, we meet, and I'm right. He wants to tell me he wants to step down, and, you know, he knows that he's been this significant father figure, and that's going to be a big deal for me. But then he says, so would you be willing to take on the leadership of Jubilee Plus? And I'm like floored by this. And I spent the next hour and a half telling him all the reasons why it shouldn't be me. I was like, Martin, I can't, like, my background, like, I don't know how to lead. I'm not a leader. And in the middle of this, people have been saying I'm a leader and stuff, but I'm like, well, am I? What does it mean even? And other people have told me I'm not a leader. So now I'm living with some voices saying you're a leader, other voices very clearly saying you're not a leader. And I'm like, so who gets to decide? I guess ultimately God, but I'm like, okay, I don't really know here. So I'm like, I'm not a leader. You know, I haven't got the right background. At which point, obviously, he says to me, if you heard anyone else say that of themselves, you would be all over it. You would not be having a word of it. He said, if I told you I was going to disqualify someone on the grounds of their background of poverty or working classness, you would be furious with me. So what are you doing? And I'm like, no, I know you're right, but this is me we're talking about. And then I'm like, you know, I'm in New Frontiers and I'm a woman. And at that point, I thought that's going to be a real barrier. Is that even possible? Am I allowed? Like, you know, and I'm single. So I'm not married to a church leader, which seemed to me like to be a woman in leadership, you had to be married to the right man, and I'm not married to any man. So, but also, you know, I've got a history of depression, like diagnosed, medicated depression. I've done things in my past that would bring the organisation into disrepute, you know, like taking drugs and stuff like. So I'm giving him all these reasons why it can't be me, it shouldn't be me. And then after about an hour and a half, he says to me, do you feel called to it? And I said, yes, I do. And I think Martin probably thought that's an hour and a half of my life I'm never getting back. Where if I'd just asked the right question at the start, I could have saved myself all that hassle. Because the truth was, even as I was giving all these reasons, I was feeling a mixture of faith rise and impending doom, knowing that I probably was going to end up saying, yes, I would like to do this. And so we had a really long transition. And to be honest, Martin was absolutely brilliant. I mean, we had like a 9-month from that conversation to me taking on the leadership. And there was obviously a process, as we told team. Everyone on the leadership team at Jubilee Plus at that time was like, oh yeah, we've seen this coming totally. And I'm like, well, no one told me, it felt like I was the only one who didn't understand what was about to happen to me. But again, I feel like God just, I love that the Bible says he's acquainted with all our ways, and he knew how I would need to be told and how I would need to have the faith rise for it. But it's been incredible. I've been leading now for 4 years. And I absolutely would still say that most days I think I do not know what I'm doing. But what's been really interesting to me is my prayer life in this 4 years has been the best it's ever been. And my relationship with Jesus has been the closest it's ever been. My intimacy with him, there's been something so sweet and so precious. And that might be only partly because of the role. I feel like that's also been something, just there's been a lot of healing. Exactly what was prophesied that I would raise to prominence as God did the healing work. I've had some counselling, which has been actually, I had that prior to that conversation with Martin, but that's been so helpful. Like, I'm the biggest advocate of Christians getting professional counselling, ideally with a Christian as well who understands your faith, but definitely who is professionally qualified to help you as well. And so I've been leading 4 years, and God has done astonishing things with Jubilee Plus in that time. It has grown massively.
So go on, I want to hear the Jubilee Plus, not sales pitch, but, what do you do? What's the driving passion? Some beautiful stories. Go for it.
Yeah, well, so we really look to help churches to get mercy and justice in the DNA. So a lot of churches over the last sort of 15 years or so, since the global financial crash and all that, have really done excellently at setting up projects to help people in crisis. So food banks, debt centres, support for pregnant women, so much wonderful, wonderful work. But in a lot of churches, they would say to us that that's become a department of church life where there's probably 10% of the congregation, maybe 20% in a really where this is a real focus, who are really passionate about it. And the other 80 to 90% are really glad to be in a church that does it. But personally, it may not have affected their own attitudes or their own behaviours in any way, other than maybe they give a bit, maybe they put some food in a basket, what have you. So for us, we really look to equip churches to get mercy and justice in the DNA as a discipleship issue that is for every single believer. Even this year, I've been living a lot in Matthew 25, where, Jesus says, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. For I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me, I was sick and you visited me, and so on and so on. And that's such a sobering passage of scripture. And I guess one of the big fears I have is that we don't tend to disciple people into the seriousness of living in a sacrificial way to give to those who've got less than we've got. And so actually people often think I'm passionate about poverty because I grew up in it. I'm actually way more passionate about the church of Jesus Christ doing the things that Jesus called us to do. I want us to be distinctive. I want us to be those who bring mercy where others have given up on people. Those who actually, someone walks into your church, it doesn't matter whether they find the food bank manager or they find the average person who never set foot in the food bank to volunteer or even given a tin of beans to it, but they'll get the same merciful response. And so we help churches through events, resources, training, all sorts of things like that to really get this in the heart of the people in their congregations. And so what we're particularly seeing at the moment is a lot of churches have become really good at projects, and projects are great. Please don't mishear me. I'm involved in projects. They are wonderful. But a lot of them actually have maybe at some point during COVID, I don't know, but stopped talking about Jesus. And so that's been historically in the UK, that's what happens. We're either as Christians really good at evangelism or really good at compassion ministries. And we tend to be on one pendulum swing to the other. We really believe we want to offer people hope for their immediate crisis and hope for their eternal crisis. So we help churches to keep remembering this is for Jesus, it's through Jesus, it's about Jesus. Let's not shortchange people. It's so important we feed people who are hungry and clothe people who don't have clothes and shelter people who don't have homes. We must do that. But we must also offer them the hope that they can know the God who made them, who loves them, who wants them, no matter what their background's like. And so that's one of our kind of key things, I think, is that we hold evangelism and social action really closely together. But also as churches, we've been great at crisis support. But I believe, and we believe, that God is now drawing us into a season where actually we offer people not just relief from their poverty, but release from their poverty as well. And that we begin to come against a kind of dependency culture and are empowering people. And obviously we hope that people will be empowered by coming to Christ and having their lives transformed in that way. But actually, even if they don't come to Jesus, we still believe that the gospel is an abundant gospel. It's an overflowing gospel. So, I've been lifted out of poverty of all forms by the gospel, but so have my family, and they don't know Jesus. And I absolutely want them to come to know Jesus. I pray for them. I pray, God, have mercy on them, and God have mercy on me by saving them. But actually, they're all out of poverty now. My mum, my brother and sister are not in poverty. And in fact, a couple of them are doing pretty well for themselves, shall we say. And I love that overflow. But let's see people empowered to come out of poverty, because the gospel is more ambitious for people than often we are. And I think sometimes we're not as ambitious for people, or maybe ambitious might be the wrong word, but we're not as faith-filled for people because it's a hard old slog. And I love that Isaiah 61 talks about they, the poor, the brokenhearted, the captives, etc. Yeah. They shall become oaks of righteousness. Because oaks are slow-growing trees. Most of them take 50 years to reach maturity. I feel so encouraged about my own walk with Jesus when I hear that. Even the fastest growing oaks take 20 years to mature. But often we want the quick fix. We want the testimony, which is, I was a drug addict, now I'm clean. I was sick and now I'm healed. We love the dramatic story. And of course, those stories are beautiful. But most often, and even for people who have those dramatic testimonies, there is then that sanctification process where we are being transformed one degree of glory to another. And I think we need to walk a longer journey with people to really see them come out of poverty, which is the harder thing to do. It's a hard slog. But I think churches at the moment in the UK are really stepping up to do that. We're hungry for more. We want to see more people saved. We want to see more people brought out of poverty, not just given what they need to keep them ticking along and surviving. And so it feels to me like an exciting season in the UK, because we're seeing churches pivot towards or return towards, we must offer people Jesus as well. And, there's a food bank up in Darlington where during the pandemic, I think they saw 83 people respond to the gospel, having been running their food bank for 9 years and not seeing a single person respond to the gospel. Right. And unfortunately, there's no magic thing that they're doing that we could all copy and then we'd all get that story. But it's just God is on the move there, and he's on the move in the margins across the UK, saving people whose lives, we might think, well, they're beyond salvation, they're beyond the reach of God because their lives are so desperate, so chaotic, and yet God is reaching in, plucking people out, but not plucking them out to then make them middle class, but plucking them out so that they can reach the people that actually will never listen to the middle classes, will never listen to the wealthy, because they'll be like, what do you know about my life? But we'll listen to the people who understand their background. And, we'll see the transformation among them. So there's so much beautiful stuff that's happening in churches, reaching out to the poorest, to seeing lives changed, and then not trying to make people nice middle-class Christians, but actually having more diversity in the body of Christ and being more comfortable with that diversity, less likely to tell people what discipleship looks like. Get your kids in the nicest school, buy the nice house, buy the, property ownership is a thing that's important, savings in the bank that, people still tell me those things are important. But I think what we're seeing is a shift to where actually people from all walks of life don't have to assimilate, but can be alongside each other in church. And there's something of celebrating and embracing that's beginning to happen, I think, in our nation.
Yeah, brilliant.
Hello, I'm Susie, and I love listening to the podcast when I'm cooking. It's just so encouraging. I get so much enjoyment out of it. I'm also a supporter of Glow, amazing organisation. So everything about the podcast is brilliant.
Oh, Natalie, it's so good to hear. Listen, time's kind of ticking away. So I'm going to ask you maybe for your final thoughts, but I'm excited that, the Lord's taken you. You're just saying before we started that you preached recently and saw 10 people come to Jesus. There's an openness in the nation. You're talking about churches ramping things out, getting Jesus back in. I mean, we are, folks, we must not be, Romans 1:16, we must not be ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. And we want to see lives changed. The power for life change comes through an encounter with Jesus. And Natalie has lived that out for herself. She's experienced it. And now she's passing that blessing on to so many people. I love what you're doing. So give us some final thoughts and parting challenge. Go for it.
Yeah, well, we started by saying where we met at the parliamentary prayer breakfast, and now people have heard a bit of my story. They'll probably be more amazed. What are you doing sitting at a parliamentary, like a posh parliamentary breakfast? And I guess what I'd want to say to people is God can take you from any background into any future. Like your past doesn't actually, in the gospel, it doesn't have to limit your future. I've been able to sit down with MPs, even with like cabinet ministers, and talk about poverty in the nation and try to affect change along with many others as well in certain areas of public life. But then I also, so a couple of weeks ago, I'm at the parliamentary prayer breakfast. And then a few days ago, I was just at something called Encounter Camp in Worcestershire, where I'm in a big marquee with 160 people. And the guy leading the meeting says to the people who are there, if any of you would be dead, like physically dead, not spiritually, but physically dead, if Jesus hadn't grabbed hold of your life, put your hand up. And among 160 people, at least 90% of the hands in the room went up, because this is a camp for people with life-controlling issues, mostly addictions, like substance addictions. But these are people, and just being with this crowd of people and seeing them worship, it was the biggest honour. It was a phenomenal experience. And, you can kind of think the corridors of power are where it's at. But actually that field in Worcestershire is where it's at. And what I realise is I'm in a room full of overcomers. Well, I'm in a marquee full of overcomers here. These are people who love Jesus, who've had an encounter with him. And to be honest, a lot of their lives are still pretty chaotic. They're still struggling with some stuff. It's a camp where you have to check in your prescription, like your methadone or whatever. As you come onto the camp, you have to give it to the camp doctor to be given it when you need it and things like that. And yet these are people who, arms in the air, worshipping Jesus. And something that God said to me, I realise is true of so many of us. A couple of years ago, I was really like having this prayer time where I was sobbing my heart out to God. I'd messed up. I'd made a mistake. To be honest, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't even a big mistake. But I just remember saying to God, I look back at my Christian life and it seems like it is mess after mess after mess. I was like, it's my mess. A lot of it's my own mess, but I've been collateral damage in other people's stories quite often as well. And I'm like, God, I just see mess after mess after mess. And I'm so like, I wish this wasn't my story. And I just felt the beautiful whisper of the Holy Spirit, not audibly, but just in my heart, saying, when I look at your life, I see mercy after mercy after mercy. And it's totally transformed the way I see my story. At that point, God said to me, stop telling people that you are someone who wrestles with God. I used to send people my bio, when I'm speaking at a conference or whatever, and say, Natalie's been wrestling with God since she was 15. God said, stop saying that. You don't wrestle with me anymore. You are someone who is joyfully obedient to me. Like I've rewritten the labels. Where once rejection loomed large over me, it felt like the banner over me was rejection. Now, the banner over me is what it says in Isaiah 62 verse 4, my delight is in her. And so for anyone who's listening who thinks, but you don't know my life, or, you don't know the chaos I've caused or the things that have been done to me, Jesus has this most beautiful, merciful way of retelling our stories and reshaping our futures that should never come out of our pasts. A friend of mine said to me last month, little Nat should not have turned into the woman you are today. And I just, in that moment, I felt, wow, Father, I am a trophy of your grace, not by my works, wholly by his grace and his mercy on my life. And he is the God who can transform any life into anything he wants to. Don't let our pasts dictate our futures. Don't let our stories be written by the worst things that happened to us or the worst things we've ever done. Let our stories be written by what Jesus Christ says about us. And if we're his, he says, you're mine, you're my beloved, and my delight is in you. It's wonderful.
Well, I've had goosebumps and wanting to interrupt and shout hallelujahs over that last 2 minutes of you. Preach it, sister. That was so beautiful. Guys, you might just want to rewind and listen to that about 3 times, because that was gold, and that was so important for many of us in our brokenness to hear. So praise the Lord. Amazing grace. Guys, I know you're going to want to share this with people, so do pass it on. Gossip the podcast. Can I challenge you to get 5 new subscribers for us? Why not? Just because it's people. We need this stuff. It's just pure truth. It's good news. It's redemption. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing, Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Please give us a great review on Spotify, iTunes. Natalie will put all the stuff on Jubilee Plus and your own details, whatever you want. Your books that people can get hold of. Tis Mercy All's the latest, absolutely brilliant. I was chomping on that last night in preparation, and just want to cheer you on, sister. You are doing a great job, and your team. Keep going, keep stirring the church, keep being a prophetic, challenging voice to us. Many of us, the church is statistically very middle class in this nation, and we need to be stirred and challenged, because the gospel is certainly not middle class. The gospel is a radical. It applies to everybody in every situation in every nation. We've got a mandate to get out there and change the world. So I hope you've been encouraged this week. God bless you, Nat. Have a good day. See ya.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good day too.
Yeah, wonderful. Woo, brilliant, guys. Have a good week. See you next time. Another fantastic guest, very different story. God bless you, and toodaloo.